Hey there. So we are going to do our lecture for today or this week. This is week 7, and I just kind of wanted to start out a little bit differently today. Um, I have been thinking a lot about General Conference. I've just been reading it. I mentioned that earlier in the term. But I was reading this talk today, and I just felt like I should share it. So the quote says, "The Lord loves effort, and effort brings rewards. We keep practicing, we're always progressing as long as we are striving to follow the Lord. He doesn't expect perfection today. We keep climbing our personal Mount Sinai. As in times past, our journey does indeed take effort, hard work, and study, but our commitment to progress brings eternal rewards." I know sometimes it probably feels like, what am I doing in school during this pandemic? Or sometimes just life is a lot. And I just wanted to remind you, because I guess this was really helpful for me as well, that that's kind of the point of this life. It's for us to work and strive. The word I thought was really interesting here was study. That there's mysteries that can be unfolded to us when we really devote ourselves to that. So anyway, I hope that this helped whoever needs it, because I just felt like I needed to share it. But I guess we'll transition now. I'm going to do a couple of things with you today. I'm going to give you some tips for your proposal that's due on Saturday, and then I'm going to go over the lecture part of the slideshow. So let's start with that. The proposal, remember, is essentially an argument that's you're giving to your reader. Your audience, when you're writing a proposal, is almost always someone who has more power than you do, who is a superior. And the argument that you're making is, I want to do this research. Sometimes we do proposals in the business world. If we're doing that, it's usually for research or for you're creating some arguments for an expenditure, using company money, or anything to persuade. Okay, so that's what a proposal is to persuade. So in this case, you're persuading me to do research on this research question that you shared with me on the Google Doc that we have. Okay, so I'm going to go to a different screen really quick and show you. So this is the Google Doc that we have been working on, and research questions over here. So I looked over all of them, and there's some really fun ones. I'm really excited. No news is good news in this case. If I haven't reached out to you, then don't worry about it. They were really good. And honestly, the more specific they are, the little bit easier it's going to be. This one I really loved, and so I'm sorry I'm kind of calling you guys out, but this is a pretty simple question. So why do most online students turn their cameras off or pay attention to their own portrait during class? So there's two different questions going on there, but that's going to be easy to figure out. Okay, that's going to be one that we can answer. So that's one of my first tips for you, is that you have these research questions. Now you want to make sure that you can measure that question. So in the case of that group, which I'm giving them tons of help, but I'm going to use them as an example. In the case of that group, you want to be able to figure out how you're going to answer that question. How can you measure that? Obviously, we're going to probably do a self-reporting thing where they might ask people, like, why do you turn your picture off? Why do you turn your camera off during a class, or whatever the case might be? And then they could give you an answer, and then that answers that research question. So honestly, the more specific they are and the easier they are to measure, the easier it will be for you to complete this assignment. So that's your first tip. Your second tip is actually a reminder that this needs to be written in APA style. So your citation, your references, your title page, all of these things need to be in APA. So I've included in the slideshow, which I will send to you, two links to an APA style guide reference. So this is new, at least as far as I'm aware, that BYU has this APA style guide. So this is for the psychology department. However, we all use APA in the social sciences. And so they have tons of information here to help you to be able to use APA appropriately. They also have a librarian that is an expert in APA, and I did not know this until I did my doctoral work that these types of librarians even existed. So I would highly recommend that if you have some questions about APA, that you get a hold of Sister Darowski, because she's going to be able to go through your paper and be able to help you with APA in a way that you've never known before. If you feel like you're kind of similar with it and you're okay with it, of course, there's all of these resources here that they have, and which is just great. I just found this. I had no idea that it was there. So the other one that we use a lot is Purdue's APA style guide. And when I mean we, I mean like academia as a whole across the world. Even when I was living in New Zealand, we used Purdue's APA style guide. So that's another place that you can go. Again, their link is there, and they have a tremendous amount of help and tutorials on how to write in APA. So two big things to kind of help you with that. And then I just wanted to remind you that the methods section of your proposal is a recipe. It's like a recipe. Remember, you're going to kind of detail out how you're going to conduct this research. The reason we do this is so the research can be replicated. So maybe the group that's asking the question about why do you not share your video during a Zoom class, they're going to explain to me how they're going to do that. And then I could take that method section if it's well written, and I could do the exact same thing. And then we could compare and contrast our results. So remember, the method section is a recipe, and the point is for it to be replicated in theory, right? Okay, so just be mindful of that. So hopefully those are tips and tricks for this paper. Again, if you have any questions, of course, you can send me or Rachel a question, and we're happy to answer and help out with those. Okay, so on to our lecture. So this, let me go back. This particular set of readings was like a mishmash of a bazillion different topics. So I've tried to actually give you some transition and segue that link these different chapters together. I don't think the book does that particularly well. It's almost like these last three chapters, the editor was like, you've got to talk about these three topics. And so they were kind of shoved in there or something. I don't mean to be rude, but it is really kind of like, wait, what? And also what's interesting about these particular chapters and how related yet unrelated they are is that they are their own disciplines themselves. And so we could really have a semester on each one of these chapters, where other chapters we've kind of talked about things. I mean, we could maybe do a few weeks on it, but not a semester. But these chapters have a lot of information. So in a lot of ways, what we're doing with chapters 11 through 13 is we're just kind of skiing over the top of the topics and introducing you to this information. And then in the future, if these are interesting topics to you, you can explore them a little more in the program when you get in your upper division classes. Okay, so one of the big questions, and this, for me, this is always a really interesting issue, is information online or in advertising or marketing, is it information or persuasion? And it's interesting, when we teach this in 101, we teach persuasion with advertising. However, with the advent of social media, one of the most popular trends is educational advertising, or educational marketing is what we call it. And in this case, what we would be doing is we would be giving information with the intent at the very end of that information to invite the person who is listening to buy a product of some kind or to learn more information, and then maybe buy a product. Okay, so information or persuasion, I think this is a really interesting idea. We now know it's both. So no matter how the book is written, you're gonna see more marketing, particularly on social media platforms, that fit into the information category than in a straight persuasion category. So one of the topics that Humphreys talks about is this idea of push and pull marketing. And I wanted to make sure that you understood what these phrases mean. So remember, push marketing is persuasion. It is persuasive advertising. So it's essentially saying this product that I have, so the example that I have here is a Coca-Cola, is the best product, therefore you should buy it and drink it. Pull marketing is the opposite, right? So when we're dealing with social media, we're working a lot with pull type of marketing, where you're doing a search for something specific, and then the product information comes up. So maybe you're doing a search for, I'll just give an example. We went to Mexico not too long ago. Well, last year we went to Cancun in March, and it was interesting because I was looking for some pyramid tours, and so I just did a search on Google for like pyramid tours, and what came up in the advertisements was actually a company that was located in Provo. Now, some of that has to do with my location, right? Because Google's going to take that into account when the advertisements on your screen are brought up. And I still get newsletters from them. I still am engaged with this particular company because I really liked what they were doing. But that was pull marketing. It was just from me doing a Google search. Or another place where you could see that is just trying to learn information about something. Again, maybe you want to do social media marketing, so you're trying to learn all the ins and outs about it. And so you do a search for how to learn about social media marketing, and you find out there's a whole class out there that you could take, and you purchase the class, right? That's a pull marketing process. So that's the difference between those. I think it's important just from a digital literacy to understand what push and pull marketing is. The other thing I felt like you needed to understand was the media types in marketing. So we have the paid, the owned, and the earned. Okay, so these are, again, just prolific, and you could see each one of these on a social media platform. So paid is where the company buys time or space on a platform that already exists, and to get their message to the audience to which it would most apply, right? Because we've got targeted marketing going on here. So an example of this would be ads on YouTube. I did a search just now when I was prepping this for TikTok, a TikTok video, because I know I keep talking about TikTok. And it's a parody, it's really funny. But what was funny is the advertisement that played before the video was like a 14-year-old girl talking about teen issues. And I just thought it was so funny to me. But they know that the target market for like TikTok would be a teen girl. So that's a paid advertising. Owned is where the company builds and owns the platform. So like a company website is an example of owned media. So if you think about it, the website that you're building for yourself, your personal brand, is actually an advertisement or marketing for you and your professional experience. So basically, your online presence is persuading others that you are a knowledgeable and viable person for their job. So that's owned advertising, okay, or owned marketing. The last one is earned, and this is all about word of mouth. So this is a very, very powerful, as you've read and probably as you've experienced, where we're looking at a situation where it's not just like someone else said that it was a good product, but that there are a lot of people who say it's a good product, and a lot of them are really positive examples. If you remember in the reading though, despite having a ton of positive word of mouth kind of advertising and feedback and remarks about a product, we remember the negatives more often. So when we're talking about earned advertising and this idea of word of mouth, it's really important also that we understand that if we're looking at a product to buy and there's a lot of negative feedback about it, we'll remember it. If you remember from the reading, that's also a firestorm when all of a sudden it's not just one or two people who are giving negative feedback about a product, but it's hosts and hosts of people giving feedback about a product. So again, if you have any questions about that, of course you can ask me, but these are pretty straightforward and something that we deal with all the time. This is just an opportunity for us to give a name to what we're dealing with. Okay, so something else that she had in here was the purchase funnel and the decision journey. And this is, again, if you're interested in doing social media marketing as a profession, these are really important and helpful information to know. So this is not my particular area of expertise, but I did find a blog, which again, educational marketing, what they were trying to do on this website that I pulled this image from was they were trying to say, this is what the decision journey looks like, but if you want to learn more, you can take our masterclass and we can teach you the details of each one of these issues in the purchase funnel. So but I felt like this was enough to kind of give you a sense of what we're trying to do is we're trying to really gather people in to eventually and hopefully make a commitment and a sell. That way we can obviously make our company viable by selling our products, whatever the case might be. So as far as chapter 11 goes, that's kind of all I'm going to cover on it there. There are other classes that you can take about this that will go into these in a lot more detail. Again, I just wanted to expose you to this stuff. I'm more of a culture person, and so I focused a little more on the other two chapters. But if you do have any questions on any of these, again, just let me know and I can help you make sense of it a little better if it seems confusing. So I wanted to be able to tie the social media marketing chapter to the culture chapter. So I've included this TED Talk by Sheena Iyengar, and I love her work. Basically, in this TED Talk, if you choose to watch it, she explains that this decision-making funnel is deeply influenced by culture. And so it's not just that we go through this process, but that there's also this external influence that they're not accounting for. And so in her TED Talk, she explains what that is. She's a very funny and delightful and really easy to watch. So I really hope that you choose to watch that because it'll kind of tie in that chapter 11 with chapter 12, which is all about culture and how social media perpetuates culture, how our conversations perpetuate culture. And this is the stuff that kind of gets me really excited. So we're going to talk about participatory culture first. And if we did not have the internet, this would look very different. Participatory culture has almost completely taken over pop culture, and that's new. It hasn't always been that way. So participatory culture is a culture with low engagement barriers for artistic expression. So if you remember from a few weeks back, we talked about how the reason why we can even create online media and access it and watch it and engage in it is because of the amount of leisure time that we have. And so that's what this idea of low engagement barrier means. It basically is saying most of us, well, many of us are able to put food on our table. we have housing, we have clothing, those fundamental needs are met in some way. Therefore, we can engage in artistic expression by creating and recreating cultural symbols. Now, we could break down what I just said, because there could be a lot of things wrong with that. But I'm just trying to give you a basic example of how even, I'm thinking of even people who are homeless. I've run into people who have their own cell phones and they're using it for a purpose that I would have never anticipated, right? They're engaging in their own artistic expression or experience. And so again, just kind of a disclaimer on what I said, but what I'm trying to do is explain that the engagement barriers, that the things that inhibit our ability to create art, many of those have been taken away in modern life, so we can participate to the full extent that we want to. It has some relationship. So this is Jenkins. He's saying it has some relationship with traditional folk culture in terms of information learning and social reproduction. So because we come from different areas in the world and in the United States, I'm not sure like regionally what your experience was like, but it seems like there was a period of time when the church would support and do these kind of like plays and presentations where they would recreate skits and all kinds of things. So when we're talking about folk culture and information learning and social production, traditionally, that's what it looked like. It's this recreation of a theater production, or it's a recreation of a skit that's really funny. I'm thinking of Scouts, for those of you who might have participated in Boy Scouts. So those kinds of things. But now we don't do that in the same way. We do it digitally. So this video on the side here is totally a parody about teaching people about TikTok, what it is and what kinds of things you would expect to see on it. Hopefully you can watch it and just laugh, but also hopefully it'll give you an example of what I'm talking about here, because he's basically in very, very simple terms explaining information learning and social reproduction. All right, so let's go on to the next thing. So let me move this here. So the other thing we have is fan fiction. This was another primary issue that Humphreys talked about. So fan fiction takes elements of the original story and remixes them in a variety of ways for a variety of purposes. So the very first thing that came to my mind was something like this: Pride and Prejudice in zombies. Often we think of music because, well, we can think of music. People actually literally write fiction stories. This is obviously a screenplay. I'm trying to think. This is just everywhere. But I just always think of like Comic-Con and kind of even recreating this kind of costume. So it's not just fiction itself, but this kind of recreation of the original story and remixing them into your own life to make it applicable to further the information or to further the storyline. So I'm not sure if I've taught you about parasocial relationships or not, but parasocial relationships is a definition or is a term that could be defined by the relationship that we have with fictional characters. So I might be watching a television show and talk about the main character like they are my friend. Or I notice this with The Bachelor a lot, like with my students, they often talk about how so-and-so did this or so-and-so did that as if they were there and they were friends with the person. So that is parasocial relationships. What we're doing with fan fiction is we're taking parasocial relationships and we're pushing them to the next level. But it also like perpetuates culture too, right? Pride and Prejudice is an incredibly old story. So to have it be enjoyed and remade and then to create fan fiction around it like this movie over and over again perpetuates some of the principles and ideas that we find in Pride and Prejudice and Jane Austen's work. So this is a very Western European influential example. We could probably find this examples culturally in other areas as well. But I thought this one just made me laugh the most because when it came out, I thought it was so bizarre. Okay, the next thing is the mashups, the mix-ups, the parodies, the repetition of one cultural element. And this is where we're kind of dealing with cultural transmission, where there's one pop culture thing that seems to pop up over and over again. So Studio C, I'm not sure how many of you watch Studio C, but they do this all of the time. That's basically what they specialize in. And so we can see this, again, this music, right? We see this in music, particularly with EDM, electronic dance music. We see these mix-ups and mashups just pervasively. Now, this is an interesting issue because it gets into ethics, like what's appropriate and what's not appropriate to mix up and mash up. But I mean, that's really for you to decide. My biggest interest for you is that you understand that these are actually academic terms that we use to be able to make sense of pop culture and the way it spreads so rapidly from one generator, one creator to a large culture to others. So this one is about Studio C, or I'm sorry, it's about Scooby-Doo because there's a new Scooby-Doo movie coming out, right? We're also doing this, if we think about it in terms of marketing, we're also doing things like parodies or mashups or remixes because something is already popular. And we know that because of pool marketing, we're going to get a lot of hits because if somebody does a search for Scooby-Doo, hopefully the SEO, the search engine optimization is high enough that for Studio C that this video would also come up as an option for someone who's doing a search to watch. I did another one as well. I'm just going to show you a little bit of this one. This is Divine Comedy, which still exists. I don't know how many of you are familiar with them, but this is a really old one, but I think it is so funny and I think it encapsulates the testing centers so well. So even though I didn't do any I didn't do any of my education at BYU. However, from what I've heard from students about the testing center, this video is it. So I'm just going to show you a little bit of it, and then if you think it's interesting, you can go back and watch it. We'll see if they pull it down, actually, like. Take it just to make you cry. Blame it all on BYU, baby. It started like you knew your stuff, but 15 weeks was not enough. Cause someone's gonna skew that curve, baby. Okay, so hopefully you kind of get a sense of this. But what is interesting about this is that even though the testing center has this really awkward reputation, things like this song, this parody, just reinforce that. It just makes it worse, okay? So this is an example of that remix, but it's also an example of cultural transmission. So cultural transmission is essentially, we have these primary ideas as a culture, the way we see the world, the way we think the world should work, and we share them through the art that we create in all of its forms, and also through our teachings in our homes and in our religions. And this video explains what cultural transmission is in more detail. But this idea that the testing center is the worst, the absolute worst, and then to take a music video and to share that and to watch it and identify with it just reinforces that, right? It just makes the testing center also just be more the worst. So that's something that I really, really love about about the idea of parodies and remixes, is that in the most subtle way possible, it's essentially reinforcing ideas that we might already have or that we don't have yet, but then we take upon ourselves. Okay, so the next piece of this is phatic communication. Phatic communication is language that does not necessarily communicate information, but it's like, it's not like slang. This one is kind of interesting. So I gave some examples here. So if I just said to someone who doesn't text or who isn't, I don't know, 25 and younger, IDK, if they didn't have anybody in their life in that, they would have no idea what that means, right? Like my son, instead of saying, I don't know, sometimes says to me, IDK. Like, what? That's not language, right? But it is a symbol of a meaning. And so this phatic communication is also regional. It's also ethnically specific. I'm sure there are words or things or phrases that don't necessarily communicate information, but they communicate maybe an emotion, like ye or meh, you know, things that like we know what it means, but if you had to try to explain it, like trying to explain how salt tastes, it'd be like, it's like this, right? It would have to be all nonverbal expressions. So again, this is a cultural thing. So I'm sure some of you who have served mission in other cultures, who come from different cultures, who come from different regions, there might be phrases, words, grunts, whatever they might be, that would fit into this category. Okay, so cultural transmission, I taught you about that. This video is really cool. And what's interesting is that if we broke it down, we would say that the idea of evolution and how we all evolved from monkeys is one of the culturally transmitted ideas in here that they actually use an assumption. They assume everybody believes that. So that's also what makes cultural transmission dangerous, is this, like, these underlying assumptions that if you hear them over and over and over again, you believe them to be true. So when we talk about body image and the media, it's usually because of cultural transmission. It's not because anyone said, you have to look like this. It's just that we've heard and we've seen these messages over and over and over again, and therefore we believe them to be true, or they become like kind of grounded in our mind as truth. Part of that is how ethnicity, nationality, gender, all of these are represented in the media. And so I wanted to include this in there as well. This is called the Representation Project. And they focus on this, like their whole purpose is to make sure that the media represents well the world that we live in, that it's not homogenous, that it doesn't look like just one ethnicity or one way of thinking, because we live in a deeply diverse world. And that's important. We're going to come back to that in a minute, to have this idea of diversity, and particularly the diversity of ideas, which we call plurality, to be out in the conversations that we have in public and to be talked about. So I'll come back to that, but this idea of the Representation Project, I just wanted to explain why I included this in there, is because we are also trying to represent cultures that might not be mainstream. Okay, so so here's how I'm trying to tie this together. So with pop culture and the way we transmit culture comes the way we transmit political beliefs and political culture as well. So this meme I wanted to use, now you have probably gathered that I'm fairly politically minded, but I thought this was a great way, again, to kind of transition from this like what to this next what chapter from 12 to 13, that when we're talking about political culture, that we're also engaging in pop culture as well, and that they do go hand in hand. So if you're not really into politics, think about it in terms of popular culture and like, how is this reflected in the movies? How is this reflected in music? How is this reflected in my daily life without me even realizing it? And maybe you might be a little more interested in politics if you kind of take it from that approach. So when we're talking in politics, the first thing we need to talk about is power. It's part of the reason I find it so interesting. Maybe I'm power hungry. I don't know. Like being an adjunct professor, I don't have a lot of power in anything, but she gives you, in the textbook, she gives you Herbert Mead's power thing, I think. It's one of the philosophers who kind of started the conversation on power, but it definitely did not end there. So I wanted to expand your mind a little bit on this idea of power and how we all have power in different ways. So the first one, and these, if you do a search for the types of power online, you can learn more about these. They've come from different authors. And so when we compile them together, we say, you know what, there's not just 3 types of power, there's actually 8 types. Some people argue there's 9, and I'll add that on at the end in just a second. But there's really quite a few ways that we can influence and persuade others through our own power. So the first one's legitimate power. So that when we're thinking about like people being powerful, like this is the traditional idea of power. So this would be like someone who's in a leadership position, or someone who's in a managerial position, like a professor. Like in my case, I have legitimate power in the classroom, but there's more to it, right? So there's also expert power. So that would be number 3. So I've spent 15 years in school, learning, reading, writing, and so now I'm gonna share that with you by sharing my information, okay, which is 2, right? So you can see we've got these going hand in hand, but they are nuanced, but they are very different. So can a person have legitimate power but not be an expert or have information? Yeah. So I'm thinking of, I don't know, President Trump. Anyway, he is always, I shouldn't say always, that's terrible, but on occasion he does give very false information. And so he has legitimate power as the president of the United States, but his information is completely incorrect in some situations. So, and then he's definitely not an expert there either, right? Which is why, like if you are a wise politician, you're going to bring in experts in various fields to advise you, because you don't know everything. You shouldn't think you know everything, because you don't. All right, so you can kind of see how those top 3 work together, right? So we have legitimate power, kind of that traditional power. Information is the information that a person has that someone else wants, and they have the power to give it to you or to keep it to themselves. Expert power is about the knowledge and experience, like they have a ton of knowledge and experience, and therefore they're going to share that information. So where this is different, information power could be anyone. Anyone could have information power. Expert power looks different. It's not anyone that can have expert power. There's, if we go back to kind of that spiritual thought from Sister Jones, there's a lot of work that's already gone on in this person's life before they can share that expert knowledge base or experience with you. So the difference between 2 and 3 is time and effort. Reward power is a leader who has the ability to reward someone. So I always think of parenting, like a parent can kind of they can reward a child. That's a power dynamic that they have. The classroom, I can do that. I can give you extra credit if you do rewards, but can your peer give you extra credit? Like, can your classmate give you extra credit? No, they can't, right? They don't have that power. So hopefully that gives you an example of how it's like an ability to have access to resources. Okay, so coercive power is the opposite of reward power, and it's a punishment. So can your group member have coercive power? Some people try to. And that's what makes working in a group so terrible sometimes, right? So this is interesting, but this is essentially like a punishment, an attempt to control. But what's interesting about coercive power is that it's up to us if we're the person who is trying to be controlled, like someone is using coercive power on us, it's up to us to choose whether or not we're going to give in to their thing. So in that case, then we have a different type of power. We have moral power. Okay, so that's number 8. So just because of our integrity and our own boundaries, we might say, no, that stops there. I'm going to keep you at an arm's length. Okay, so referent power goes back to the networks that we talked about, the bridge building, and the bonding, like how well we know who we know. All of that matters in our power and our access. 7 is charismatic power. So have you ever just met someone that they're so, something about them is so enchanting that you just kind of believe everything that they say, and then you're like, wait, what? That is all charisma. So just this kind of fundamental ability to influence others. So the one I don't have on here, and I didn't put on because it's still in debate, is interpersonal power. So interpersonal power is essentially kind of like the referent power, like where you sit in your network of people and how well you can access that network, and where they can help you get to. Interpersonal power is kind of like that one-on-one, like how much power do you exhibit in a dyadic relationship. So again, that one's kind of up for debate, but you can kind of see like there are a lot of powers, and we can choose kind of what powers we will use and we won't use, how powers we can access and we cannot access. So that has to be the foundation then. This idea of power has to be the foundation for us to understand like political life and social media and how we talk to each other about things. So I mean, if we just pull this out of context and pull it out of chapter 13 and say it's just on its own, like we could truly have a whole semester about just power. We would learn that what makes a healthy or an unhealthy marriage, for example, would be how the power is balanced, or a healthy or unhealthy relationship between parents and their children. It's how power is balanced. But if we think about the power that our Savior has and how he balances that with us, then we can kind of see an example of what a true appropriate balance looks like. So again, just a power for me, very interesting. And I hope this kind of maybe piques your interest as well. So with power comes influence, right? It comes access and the ability to persuade. So the public sphere is basically a philosophy that says, in order for democracies to work, we all need to have a voice, and we need to have a place where we can talk about everything under the sun, because at its core, all things have some kind of political foundation. And now you might not believe that, but political philosophy argues that. So for example, in order for me to be able to have all of this time to be able to even use social media, it's because I live in a democracy with a supported economic system that takes away a lot of the worries that I have so that I can just function in my daily life. So roads, for example, it drives me nuts when people say taxes are stealing, because we all have to get places, and transportation, even the roads that we drive on, are funded by government programs. And so if we don't support those, even those basic things, then we're taking for granted what we have. But the public sphere says we need to be able to talk about that. We need to be able to have a place where people can say, you know what, I don't appreciate how many taxes are being taken out of my paycheck. I don't feel like my roads need to be paved to the quality or quantity that they are. I don't feel like as a community we should have to pay for bathrooms at the park or whatever the case might be. So this is an argument or a philosophy that was created by Jürgen Habermas. And this video right here basically explains the public sphere in more detail. Now, obviously, depending on your power level, it's going to determine how much influence you have and what kinds of things you can say and basically get away with. So this idea that people were actually drinking Clorox because of the pandemic, because they heard someone who had a lot of influence and power say that it was okay or it would help them, is so very alarming. But even though it's a very sad example, it is an example of how persuasive power can be in the public sphere. Okay, so to go along with this then, we have social movements, and this is social movement theory. I cannot think of a better time when we could be talking about this. So basically, Humphreys in the textbook, she outlines the social movement theory for you. I'm just giving you an example on the slide of how it currently applies with everything that's gone on with George Floyd's death. So what's the social issue? It starts with the social issue. In this case, the social issue is mass incarceration and minority murders by police officers. So you can see that I've super stripped this down. The social issue is not Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter is important. That is a tactic. The hashtag is a tactic to be able to address mass incarceration and minority murders by police officers. Okay, so that's the next part of the social movement, is that individuals who have the power, who are in leadership, who have the influence, create tactics, actual tactics, like the protests where you physically go to a protest, or e-tactics where you have a hashtag campaign, like hashtag Black Lives Matter, or repertoires, or which is like a script of things that you say. So an example of something that I've seen on social media that I think is really, really beautiful is African-American individuals just creating little videos of themselves and saying, will you be my friend? And that's all they say is, will you be my friend? That's a repertoire. But what they're trying to do is they have a tactic there that says, we're trying to humanize everyone. We're trying to be friends with everyone so that we don't have mass incarceration anymore, so that we're not having things happen like George Floyd. Okay, the next thing is the mobilization. So mobilization is where we get some physical movement. We get some traction. The last week has been a crazy, amazing example of this. So we've coordinated, which is the next one, online using e-tactics, and now people are showing up in capitals across the nation, and they're doing protests, but they're also doing riots. And so this mobilization of riots and the burnings and the stealing and the destruction of property, the smashing of windows, those very intense type of the intense type of messaging and protesting is what helps basically bring an enormous amount of tension to the movement, because why? It's now newsworthy, right? All of a sudden, news is covering this and only this. And yet, if we take the pandemic, for example, the state of Utah is now having the highest rate of COVID cases that it's ever had, that it's had to date. But have you heard about that? Do you know that? Do you know that all of a sudden we're even in a worse state than we were before? Probably not. Maybe if you really stay up on the pandemic, like you really search out the information, Otherwise, it's just going to be more about the stuff that's happening in relation to the riots and the protests that have been going on both locally and across the nation. So wherever you are. Okay, so that's social movement. So with social movement, what we have is agenda setting. So agenda setting essentially says that the news media is going to set the agenda for what we talk about. So in the case that I was just giving you, the news media is saying, we need to talk about the riots, we need to talk about the protests, we need to talk about Black Lives Matter, we need to talk about police brutality, we need to talk about mass incarceration because of the social movements that are happening. So agenda setting is a theory that explains why and how that happens. And part of that is framing. So in this particular video, he mentions framing, but basically framing is a perspective. It's the way, it might be the way the riots are reported. So I'll give you an example of a situation that happened in Salt Lake City. So when they had their first protest in Salt Lake City and they flipped over the first car, there was people saying, look, this is happening in Salt Lake City. They flipped over a car. But there were also citizen journalists there. So citizen journalism, remember, is basically anyone being able to report on something as it's happening. So there's some citizen journalism there, and we've got some white girls standing on top of this car that's been turned over, doing twerking and other stereotypically African American dancing. And the African American community that I am associated with was so offended by what was happening. So you can see that we could be reporting from the young woman on the car, or we could just be reporting that the car got flipped over and that people were on the car, and so depending on the perspective will determine how it's framed. And framing then becomes really important, particularly with news media. Okay. All right. So again, another video here for you to learn more about agenda setting. Agenda setting is something that we talk about in 101 as well. And so I'm not going to spend tons and tons of time with that. But you do need to know that news consumption and civic engagement are directly connected. So I think this is something that is really fascinating to me, because anymore, many of my students are not interested in the news and they're not interested in politics unless they're international students. What that says to me is that we're living so comfortably that you don't have to be worried about it. My students who are international students who come from areas where their political system is not as stable as it is in the United States, it's a concern, and therefore they engage in a lot of news, and therefore they're civically involved. Okay, so just be mindful that if you don't like news or you don't like politics, it's probably because you're sitting in a pretty good spot. You don't need to worry about it. Okay, so I just pulled this off the Pew Research Center. They have an entire webpage and research team just devoted to this topic. So this is just something that I pulled off as a fairly recent table. So it just says knowledge about the coronavirus vaccine and origin vary by main source for political news. So depending on what news you watch will determine how you view the vaccine. And so you can see right here, so among those, so here's the news source for the individuals. So they use MSNBC, CNN, or Fox News. And then they ask them 2 questions. A vaccine will be available in a year or more. So if you watch MSNBC, you know that the virus came about naturally. You'll know that. If you watch Fox News, you might not believe that. And you definitely don't believe it. Here, like, so that's alarming, right? So because of this division, determining on what our news source is, it's difficult to get on the same page. Okay. All right. So the last thing again is Alter's book. So, okay. So in Alter's book, to make a major transition now, he's basically still explaining to us why social media, why phones, why this world that we live in, this digital world we live in, has become so addictive. So 3 points I want to point out to you that I think are the major issues that we need to consider in this chapter. The first one is that we are wired for closure. So if you've ever broke up with someone and you didn't feel like it wrapped up very well, it will bother you. It usually does. And it's because you don't feel like there's any closure. And obviously, depending on who you are and depending your personal temperament, and I would say your gender, will determine how well you handle that, like that closure, okay? Outwardly handle it, I should say. The second thing is that completing a task dissolves the need for the internal tension and meets our need for closure. So if I can complete a task that will meet that tension and help me wrap something up, so in the case of a game, it would be like, if I could meet that mission or I can check that box, then it's going to satisfy this like unmet need inside of me, and it's going to give me some closure. This is called the Zeragnik effect. So basically, incomplete experiences occupy our minds far more than completed ones. So, and again, some of this is temperament related, I think, but if you're a type A personality, you'll think about your to-do list and what you still need to do on it, and it's very, very stressful, right? If you're kind of a high-strung person. Not everybody is like that, but that process of being preoccupied with what's incomplete that you need to take care of, that's the Zeragnik effect. So those are the 3 things that I wanted you to take away from that chapter. Okay, I hope that helps this week and clarifies a few things. And I hope that you let me know if you have any questions. We'll be in touch. Bye.